Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the empty airfield, watching the sun set behind the hangars of Riverside Air Base. The wind carried the smell of jet fuel and memories she wished she could forget. 6 months ago, she had been Major Sarah Mitchell, one of the most skilled fighter pilots in the Air Force. Today, she was just Sarah, a woman whose career had been destroyed by one terrible moment. The accident played in her mind every night. She had been leading a training mission with 3 younger pilots. The weather had turned bad quickly, with thick clouds rolling in faster than anyone expected. In the confusion, Lieutenant Davies had panicked and lost control of his F-16. Sarah had tried to guide him through the clouds, but her radio had failed at the worst possible moment. Davies crashed into a field outside the base. He survived, but barely. The investigation that followed tore Sarah's life apart piece by piece. The review board found her guilty of poor judgment and failure to maintain proper communication with her team. They said she should have called off the mission sooner. They said she was reckless. Sarah knew the truth was more complicated, but the military didn't want to hear it. They needed someone to blame, and she was the easiest target. Her commanding officer, Colonel, had never liked having women in combat roles. He made sure the investigation went exactly the way he wanted. "You're done, Mitchell," he had told her on the day she was forced to resign. "You had one job, keep those boys safe, and you failed. Maybe it's time you found something more suitable for someone like you." Those words still burned in her chest. Someone like you. As if being a woman made her less capable of flying a fighter jet. As if her 15 years of service and perfect record before the accident meant nothing. Now Sarah lived in the small town of Cedar Falls, just outside the base. She worked at a local airport, teaching wealthy businessmen how to fly their small private planes. It was honest work, but every day felt like a reminder of what she had lost. The roar of military jets taking off from the base echoed through the town, calling to her like a song she could no longer sing. The people in Cedar Falls knew who she was. The local newspaper had covered her disgrace thoroughly, with headlines like "Female Pilot's Mistake Costs Taxpayer Millions," and "Is This Why Women Don't Belong in Combat?" The story had spread through the small town like wildfire. Everywhere she went, she felt the weight of their stares and whispers. At the grocery store, mothers would pull their children closer when they saw her. At the gas station, men would shake their heads and mutter under their breath about women trying to do men's jobs. The worst part was that some of them seemed to take pleasure in her downfall, as if it proved something they had always believed. But Sarah had learned to carry herself with dignity. She kept her back straight and her head high, even when the whispers followed her down every aisle. She had been taught that a soldier never shows weakness, never gives the enemy the satisfaction of seeing them break. In Cedar Falls, sometimes it felt like everyone was the enemy. Her small apartment overlooked the airfield where she taught flying lessons. The walls were bare except for one photograph her old squadron standing in front of their F-16s, all of them smiling and proud. Sarah was in the center, the only woman among 12 men, but she belonged there. In that picture, she was still Major Mitchell, still someone who mattered. Late at night, when she couldn't sleep, Sarah would sit by her window and watch the lights of the air base in the distance. Sometimes she would count the jets taking off and landing, imagining herself in the cockpit again. The longing was so strong it made her chest ache. She had tried to get another job flying, but Colonel's influence reached far. Every application was rejected. Every interview ended with polite excuses. The aviation world was smaller than most people realized, and word traveled fast. Sarah Mitchell was damaged goods, a pilot who couldn't be trusted. Her savings were running low, and the job at the local airport barely paid enough to cover rent and groceries. She had thought about leaving Cedar Falls, starting over somewhere new where nobody knew her story. But something kept her here, some stubborn part of her that refused to run away. This was her home, and she had served her country with honor for 15 years. She shouldn't have to hide. On this particular evening, As Sarah watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, she made a decision. Tomorrow was the graduation ceremony for the latest class of pilots at Riverside Air Base. The same ceremony she had attended every year when she was still Major Mitchell. The same ceremony where Colonel would give his speech about honor and duty and what it meant to serve. Sarah had an idea, a crazy plan that might just work. It would be dangerous, and if she got caught, the consequences would be severe. But she was tired of being invisible, tired of being forgotten. Tomorrow, she would remind everyone exactly who Sarah Mitchell used to be and who she still was inside. As the last light faded from the sky, Sarah went to her computer and began making phone calls. She had friends in the aviation world, people who knew the real story of what had happened that day, people who still believed in her, even if they couldn't say so publicly. It was time to show Cedar Falls and Riverside Air Base that Major Sarah Mitchell wasn't as finished as they thought. The next morning, Sarah drove to the small regional airport where she worked. Mountain View Airport was nothing like the massive military base she used to call home, but it had served her well these past 6 months. The owner, Jim, was a retired Navy pilot who had hired her despite her reputation. He was one of the few people in Cedar Falls who treated her with respect. "You're early today," Jim said as Sarah entered the small office building. He was a man in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes that had seen too much. "The lesson isn't until 10. Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee from the old machine in the corner. "Jim, I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust me." He looked up from his paperwork, studying her face. In the months she had worked for him, Sarah had never asked for any favors. She showed up on time, did her job well, and never complained about the pay or the conditions. "What do you need?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I need to borrow one of the planes tomorrow, the 172, just for a few hours." Jim frowned. "Tomorrow's Saturday, we don't have any lessons scheduled." "I know this isn't for a lesson." Sarah sat down across from his desk. "Jim, you know what really happened that day, don't you? You know the investigation was rigged." The older man was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I read the real accident report, not the one they released to the press. Your radio failed at the worst possible time. Davies was flying too close to you, against regulations. The Weather Service gave you bad information about the storm front. Then you know I'm not the washed-up pilot they say I am. I've watched you fly, Sarah. You're one of the best pilots I've ever seen, military or civilian. What are you planning?" Sarah leaned forward. "The graduation ceremony is tomorrow at Riverside. They're expecting clear skies and a standard flyover by their demonstration team. But what if something unexpected happened? What if someone reminded them that there are still real pilots out there, pilots they threw away?" Jim's eyes widened as he began to understand. "Sarah, that's crazy. If you buzz the ceremony without permission, they'll arrest you. Your flying license will be revoked permanently. Maybe, or maybe people will finally ask the right questions about what really happened 6 months ago." She pulled out her phone and showed him a video she had recorded the night before. It was a message from Lieutenant Davies, the pilot who had crashed during her final mission. He was calling from a hospital in Germany, where he was still recovering from his injuries. "Major Mitchell saved my life that day," Davies said in the video. "When my radio went out and I couldn't see through the clouds, she talked me through the emergency landing procedures. If she hadn't been there, if she hadn't stayed calm, I would have died. The investigation was wrong. She's the reason I'm alive." Jim watched the entire video in silence. When it finished, he looked at Sarah with new understanding. "How many people have seen this?" "Just you so far. Davies recorded it last week, but he's afraid to release it publicly. His career would be over if he contradicted the official investigation." "And you think flying over the graduation ceremony will change that?" Sarah stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the runway. A small was taking off, carrying a student pilot on his first solo flight. She remembered that feeling, the pure joy of being alone in the sky with nothing but your skills and the horizon ahead. I think people need to be reminded that the truth matters, that throwing away good soldiers to protect bad officers is wrong. She turned back to Jim. I'm not asking you to risk anything. If anyone asks, you'll say I stole the plane. I'll take full responsibility. Jim was quiet for a long time, drumming his fingers on the desk. Finally, he reached into his drawer and pulled out a set of keys. "Thee is fueled and ready. But Sarah, promise me something. Promise me you won't do anything that will get you killed. The world needs pilots like you." Sarah took the keys, her heart racing. "I promise." That afternoon, Sarah drove through Cedar Falls to pick up supplies for her plan. The town looked different to her now, as if she was seeing it for the last time. The hardware store where the owner always glared at her. The diner where the waitresses whispered about her at other tables. The library where children pointed and their mothers shushed them. Tomorrow, they would all know that Sarah Mitchell wasn't finished yet. She spent the evening in her apartment, going over the flight plan again and again. The timing would have to be perfect. The graduation ceremony started at 2 o'clock. The official flyover was scheduled for 2:30, when Colonel would be giving his closing speech about honor and duty. Sarah would arrive 5 minutes early, flying low and fast from the north. By the time anyone realized what was happening, she would already be over the ceremony. She would make one pass, just one, and then disappear into the afternoon sky. As she prepared for bed, Sarah looked at the photograph of her old squadron one more time. Tomorrow, she would either reclaim her honor or lose everything she had left. But for the first time in 6 months, she felt like herself again. She felt like Major Sarah Mitchell, fighter pilot, United States Air Force. The fear and excitement kept her awake most of the night, but she didn't mind. Tomorrow would be the most important flight of her life. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, perfect flying weather. Sarah arrived at Mountain View Airport before sunrise, her heart pounding with nervous energy. She had barely slept, but her mind was sharp and focused. This was what she had trained for her entire career: high-stakes missions where everything had to go perfectly. The 172 sat on the tarmac like a faithful friend, its white paint gleaming in the early morning light. It wasn't the F-16 Fighting Falcon she used to fly, but it would serve her purpose. Sarah walked around the aircraft, checking every bolt and wire with the thoroughness that had made her one of the Air Force's best pilots. Jim arrived an hour later, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a worried expression. "You don't have to do this," he said, handing her one of the cups. "There are other ways to fight back." Sarah tested the flaps and rudder, making sure everything moved smoothly. "I've tried the other ways, Jim. Letters to congressmen, appeals to higher-ranking officers, even hearing a lawyer. Nobody wants to listen. Sometimes you have to make them pay attention. And if they arrest you, then at least people will ask why a disgraced pilot was willing to risk everything to fly over a graduation ceremony. Maybe someone will finally ask the right questions." At 10 o'clock, Sarah climbed into the cockpit and began her pre-flight checklist. The familiar routine calmed her nerves and sharpened her focus. Switch by switch, gauge by gauge, she brought the aircraft to life. The engine caught with a satisfying rumble, vibrating through the seat and into her bones. Jim stood by the wingtip, giving her a thumbs up. Sarah nodded back, then taxied to the end of the runway. The radio crackled to life. Mountain View traffic. November 74 Alpha requesting departure to the south. Pattern altitude. It was a lie, of course. She wouldn't be flying south, and she had no intention of staying at pattern altitude. But she needed to get airborne without raising suspicions. 74 Alpha, wind is calm. Runway 27 is clear for takeoff. Sarah pushed the throttle forward and felt the familiar surge of acceleration. The lifted off smoothly, climbing into the clear morning sky. Below her, Cedar Falls spread out like a patchwork quilt, peaceful and quiet in the Saturday morning calm. But Sarah's destination wasn't peaceful. As she flew north toward Riverside Air Base, she could see the preparations for the graduation ceremony. Hundreds of cars were parked in neat rows near the parade ground. White tents had been set up for the families of the graduating pilots. A temporary grandstand faced the platform where Colonel would soon be giving his speech. Sarah circled wide to the east, staying outside the base's restricted airspace. She had memorized the approach path, timing her arrival for maximum impact. At exactly 2:25, she would come in low and fast from the north, flying directly over the ceremony at 500 feet. As she waited, Sarah thought about Lieutenant Davies, still recovering in a German hospital. She thought about the other pilots she had trained and mentored over the years, young men and women who looked up to her until the day her career was destroyed. She thought about all the future pilots who might face the same injustice if nobody spoke up. The radio in her headset buzzed with traffic from Riverside Air Base. She could hear the air traffic controllers coordinating the official flyover, 3 F-16s that would perform a missing man formation in honor of fallen pilots. Sarah had flown that same formation dozens of times when she was still Major Mitchell. At 2:20, Sarah turned north and began her final approach. The drop to 500 feet, racing across the countryside toward the base. Fields and farms flashed by below her, a blur of green and brown. Her airspeed indicator showed 120 knots, faster than she should have been flying at that altitude, but speed was essential for her plan. The base appeared ahead, its runways and buildings growing larger by the second. Sarah could see the ceremony in progress, tiny figures gathered around the platform. She was coming in from their blind spot, approaching from behind the grandstand where the families sat. At 2:24, Sarah keyed her radio to the base's frequency. Riverside Tower, this is Major Sarah Mitchell requesting permission to join the ceremony. The radio exploded with confused chatter. Tower controllers scrambled to identify the unknown aircraft. Security teams on the ground began scanning the sky, but Sarah was already over the fence, racing toward the ceremony at treetop level. She could see Colonel at the podium now, his mouth open in surprise as he spotted the approaching. The crowd below began pointing and shouting. Some people stood up, others ducked for cover. Sarah pulled back on the controls, climbing slightly to clear the grandstand. The roared over the ceremony at exactly 2:25, its engine echoing off the buildings like thunder. For one perfect moment, she was flying over Riverside Air Base again, no longer the disgraced pilot they had thrown away. As she passed over the platform, Sarah could see Colonel's face clearly. His expression had changed from surprise to fury, his fist raised toward the sky. The graduating pilots stood at attention, their heads turned upward to watch her pass. Sarah banked left and climbed away from the base, her heart racing with adrenaline and something that felt like triumph. Behind her, the ceremony had dissolved into chaos. Security vehicles raced down the runways, their lights flashing. The official flyover had been canceled, the F-16s diverted to intercept her. But Sarah had done what she came to do. For one moment, she had reminded everyone at Riverside Air Base that Major Sarah Mitchell was still alive, still flying, still fighting for the truth. Now came the hard part. She had to get away. Sarah banked the hard to the east, pushing the small aircraft to its limits as she tried to put distance between herself and Riverside Air Base. Behind her, she could hear the controlled chaos on the radio as air traffic controllers tried to coordinate a response to her unauthorized flyover. All aircraft, be advised we have an unidentified that just the graduation ceremony without clearance. Aircraft is heading east at low altitude, approximately 500 feet. Sarah switched her radio to a different frequency, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Military radar was tracking her every move, and F-16 Fighting Falcons were already scrambling to intercept her. The same aircraft she used to fly were now hunting her down. The irony wasn't lost on her. She flew low over the farmland east of the base, using hills and tree lines to break up her radar signature. It was a technique she had learned in advanced combat training, back when she was still Major Mitchell instead of a fugitive from military justice. Her plan had always been simple: make the flyover, then disappear. She had studied the terrain for weeks, identifying places where a small aircraft could land and hide. An abandoned crop duster's strip 15 miles from the base, a straight section of country road that hadn't seen traffic in years, even a large pasture where she could set down on the grass. But as Sarah flew east, something unexpected happened. Her radio crackled to life on a frequency she hadn't heard in months, the emergency channel her old squadron used to use. "Ghost Leader, this is Ghost 3. Are you out there?" Sarah's heart stopped. Ghost 3 was Captain Mike, her former wingman and one of the best pilots she had ever flown with. He had been part of her squadron for 3 years, until the accident destroyed her career and scattered her team. She hesitated, then keyed her microphone. "Ghost 3, this is Sarah. What are you doing on this frequency?" "Looking for you. We saw the news about your little stunt on the base. Pretty impressive flying for a washed-up pilot." Despite everything, Sarah smiled. Mike had always been able to make her laugh, even in the worst situations. "Where are you now?" "About 2 miles behind you, flying a borrowed F-16. I'm supposed to be escorting you back to base for questioning." Sarah checked her mirrors and spotted the fighter jet closing in behind her. Even at her top speed, the F-16 could have caught her in seconds. The fact that Mike was hanging back meant he had something else in mind. "Mike, don't do anything stupid. Your career doesn't have to end the same way mine did." "Actually, Sarah, there's something you need to know. Remember Lieutenant Davies?" "Of course I remember him. He's the reason I'm not Major Mitchell anymore." "He's not in Germany anymore. He flew back last week and he's been talking to anyone who will listen. That video he made, it's gone viral, 3 million views and counting." Sarah's hands tightened on the controls. "What are you talking about?" "Someone leaked it to YouTube yesterday. Davies tells the whole story: how your radio failed, how you saved his life, how Colonel pressured him to change his testimony during the investigation. The comments section is full of people calling for your reinstatement." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. For 6 months, she had carried the weight of that day alone, believing that the truth would never come out. Now Mike was telling her that the whole world was finally hearing Davies' side of the story. "That's not all," Mike continued. "The Inspector General's office has reopened the investigation. They want to interview you, but as a witness, not a suspect. Colonel has been relieved of command pending a full review of his conduct." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, blurring her vision. She had to wipe her eyes to keep flying. "Mike, is this real, or are you just trying to get me to land?" "It's real, Sarah. Check your phone when you get a chance. You've got about 100 missed calls from reporters, lawyers, and Air Force officials. Oh, and your old commander from called. He wants to offer you a job." There was approaching the area where Sarah had planned to land and hide. An empty field stretched out below her, perfect for a small aircraft. But now she wasn't sure she needed to run anymore. "What do I do, Mike?" "Well, you could keep running and spend the rest of your life as a fugitive. Or you could come back with me and face whatever comes next. But Sarah, for what it's worth, I think you just won the war." Sarah looked ahead at the empty field, then back at the F-16 flying escort behind her. 6 months ago, she had been stripped of her rank and forced to resign in disgrace. Today, she had buzzed a military ceremony in an act of defiance that should have ended her freedom. Instead, it might have given her back her life. "Ghost 3, this is Sarah Mitchell requesting permission to return to base." Permission granted, Ghost Leader. Let's go home. Sarah banked in a wide turn, pointing the nose back toward Riverside Air Base. Behind her, Mike's F-16 took up a proper escort position, no longer hunting her but protecting her. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she was part of a team again. As they flew west toward the base, Sarah's radio came alive with chatter from the tower. The ceremony had been canceled, but not because of her unauthorized flyover. Instead, the base commander had called an emergency meeting to address what he was calling serious questions about the integrity of recent disciplinary actions. Sarah had set out that morning to make one final statement about truth and justice. Instead, she might have started a revolution. The runway at Riverside Air Base appeared ahead, the same runway where her career had effectively ended 6 months earlier. This time, though, Sarah wasn't landing in defeat. She was coming home. The landing at Riverside Air Base was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her 15-year military career. As her touched down on the runway where she had once been based, she could see crowds of people gathered near the terminal building. News vans lined the access road, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers reaching for the sun. Mike's F-16 had peeled off to land on the parallel runway, but not before giving her a traditional military salute by rocking his wings. It was a gesture of respect between pilots, and Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion as she returned the salute. As she taxied toward the terminal, Sarah could see familiar faces in the crowd. There was Jim from Mountain View Airport, grinning widely and giving her a thumbs up. Several of her former squadron members stood in their dress uniforms, their expressions serious but supportive. And there, near the back of the crowd, she spotted Lieutenant Davies himself, walking with a cane but very much alive and present. The base security team was waiting for her, but their posture wasn't threatening. The lead officer, a master sergeant she recognized from her time at Riverside, approached the aircraft with what looked almost like respect. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to come with us. But first, I want you to know that a lot of us never believed what they said about you." Sarah shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit, her legs shaky from adrenaline and emotion. The crowd began to applaud, a slow clap that built into genuine applause. Someone shouted, "Welcome home, Major," and others took up the call. But the most important person waiting for her wasn't in the crowd at all. As Sarah was escorted toward the terminal building, she saw a familiar figure standing in the doorway, General Hayes, the base's new commanding officer and the first woman to hold that position at Riverside. General Hayes was a legend in the Air Force, a pilot who had broken barriers and faced down discrimination throughout her career. She had taken command of Riverside just 2 weeks earlier, after Colonel's sudden removal. "Ms. Mitchell," the general said as Sarah approached, "we need to talk." They walked through the terminal to a conference room where several officials were waiting. Sarah recognized the base legal officer, an investigator from the Inspector General's office, and a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself as Sarah's appointed counsel. "Before we begin," General Hayes said, "I want you to know that the Air Force is prepared to offer you a full apology for the injustice you suffered. The investigation into your final mission has been completed, and the findings are very different from the original report." She slid a thick folder across the table to Sarah. "Lieutenant Davies' testimony was just the beginning. We found evidence that Colonel had pressured multiple witnesses to change their statements. The Weather Service data that was from the original investigation showed that the storm front moved 3 times faster than predicted, and the radio failure in your aircraft was caused by a known defect that had been reported but not fixed." Sarah opened the folder with trembling hands. Page after page of evidence laid out the truth she had known all along, that the accident wasn't her fault, that she had acted with skill and courage under impossible circumstances, and that Lieutenant Davies was alive because of her actions, not despite them. "There's more," General Hayes continued. We've reviewed your entire service record, and frankly, the Air Force made a terrible mistake when we forced you to resign. Your combat experience, your training record, your leadership evaluations, you're exactly the kind of officer we need." The investigator from the Inspector General's office leaned forward. "Ms. Mitchell, we're prepared to offer you immediate reinstatement to your former rank of major, with back pay and a formal apology. We're also recommending you for the Distinguished Service Medal for your actions during the training accident." Sarah stared at the papers in front of her, the words blurring as tears filled her eyes. For 6 months, she had lived with the shame and isolation of disgrace. She had been called a failure, a washed-up pilot who didn't belong in the cockpit. The people of Cedar Falls had treated her like a pariah, whispering behind her back and making her feel like an outcast in her own. "What about Colonel?" she asked. The legal officer answered. "He's facing court-martial for conduct unbecoming an officer, obstruction of justice, and violation of his oath. The investigation found evidence of a pattern of discrimination against female officers under his command. Your case was just the most extreme example." General Hayes stood up and extended her hand to Sarah. "Major Mitchell, welcome back to the United States Air Force. If you'll accept reinstatement, I'd like to offer you a position as head of our new pilot training program. We need someone with your experience and integrity to help train the next generation of Air Force pilots." Sarah looked around the room at the faces watching her expectantly. 6 months ago, these same offices had been filled with people who wanted to destroy her career. Now they were offering her everything she had lost and more. But the decision wasn't as simple as it seemed. Sarah had learned something important during her months in exile. She had discovered strength she didn't know she possessed, the ability to stand alone and fight for what was right even when everyone else had given up on her. "General Hayes, I'm honored by your offer and I accept it gratefully, but I have one condition." "Name it." "I want to keep teaching civilian pilots at Mountain View Airport on weekends. Jim gave me a job when nobody else would, and those students deserve the best instruction they can get. If the Air Force is serious about integrity and loyalty, then we need to remember the people who stood by us when times were hard." General Hayes smiled. "Agreed. I think that's exactly the kind of perspective we need more of in the Air Force." As Sarah signed the reinstatement papers, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The disgrace, the isolation, the months of doubt and struggle, the crazy plan to buzz the graduation ceremony in a borrowed, the discovery that the truth had finally come to light. Tomorrow, she would put on her Air Force uniform again. She would pin on the oak leaves of a major and take her place among the pilots she had missed so desperately. But she would never forget the lessons she had learned during her time away from the cockpit. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who have already lost everything. Sometimes justice comes to those who are brave enough to demand it, even when they're standing alone. And sometimes, a washed-up pilot in a small civilian aircraft can remind the world what courage really looks like. 3 months later, Sarah stood once again at the edge of Riverside Air Base, but this time everything was different. She wore the crisp blue uniform of an Air Force major, her ribbons bright against her chest, including the new Distinguished Service Medal that had been pinned on her by General Hayes herself. The oak leaves on her shoulders caught the morning sun, a symbol of rank restored and honor reclaimed. But today wasn't about her past. Today was about the future. The second graduation ceremony of the year was about to begin, and Sarah was no longer watching from the outside. As the new head of pilot training, she had personally worked with many of the graduating aviators over the past 3 months. She knew their strengths and weaknesses, their fears and dreams. She had been exactly where they were now, eager and nervous and ready to serve their country. The ceremony was being held in the same location where Sarah had made her dramatic flyover 3 months earlier. The platform was in the same place, the grandstand filled with proud families. But the man at the podium was different. General Hayes stood where Colonel used to deliver his speeches about honor and duty. The difference was remarkable. Where had spoken with rigid formality, Hayes spoke with warmth and genuine respect for the young pilots she was addressing. Today, you join a tradition that stretches back to the earliest days of military aviation, she was saying. You follow in the footsteps of heroes, men and women who have served with distinction in every conflict our nation has faced. But remember, this true honor isn't just about following orders or flying faster than the enemy. True honor is about doing what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it costs you everything. Sarah smiled, knowing that those words were partly meant for her. The events of 3 months ago had changed more than just her own life. The investigation into Colonel's conduct had revealed a culture of discrimination and cover-ups that went far beyond her case. Dozens of officers had been disciplined or transferred. New policies had been put in place to protect and ensure fair treatment for all service members. Lieutenant Davies, now fully recovered from his injuries, had been promoted to captain and assigned to Sarah's training program. He had become one of her most dedicated instructors, determined to make sure that future pilots learned from the mistakes that had nearly cost him his life. As General Hayes continued her speech, Sarah heard a familiar sound in the distance, the roar of jet engines approaching the base. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the surprise she had been planning for weeks. The official flyover was scheduled to begin in 5 minutes, but Sarah had arranged for something special. She had called in favors from contacts around the world, reaching out to allies and friends in the international aviation community. The response had been overwhelming. The first aircraft to appear was an F-16 Fighting Falcon from the Thunderbirds demonstration team, flying in perfect formation with an F/A-18 Super Hornet from the Blue Angels. Behind them came aircraft from allied nations, a British Typhoon, a Canadian CF-18, and bringing up the rear, the aircraft Sarah was most excited to see. A French fighter jet, painted in the distinctive colors of the French Air Force. The crowd looked up in wonder as the international formation approached the ceremony. This was unprecedented. Never before had so many different aircraft from so many different nations participated in a graduation flyover at Riverside Air Base. But Sarah's surprise wasn't finished yet. As the formation passed over the ceremony, they broke away from the group and began to climb. Higher and higher it rose until it was just a speck against the blue sky. Then suddenly, it went silent. The pilot had shut down the engine. In the eerie quiet that followed, they began to descend in a perfect gliding spiral, its wings catching the sunlight as it fell toward the earth in controlled silence. It was a maneuver that required incredible skill and nerves of steel, bringing a fighter jet down without power, using only the aircraft's natural aerodynamics and the pilot's expertise. The crowd watched in breathless silence as they continued its spiral descent. At what seemed like the last possible moment, the engine roared back to life, and the aircraft pulled out of its dive with barely 100 feet to spare. It screamed across the ceremony at low altitude, then climbed away into the afternoon sky. The silence that followed was broken by thunderous applause. The graduating pilots were on their feet, their eyes wide with amazement. Their families in the grandstand were cheering and pointing at the sky. Even the normally reserved General Hayes was clapping enthusiastically. But for Sarah, the most important reaction came from a different source entirely. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an international number, the pilot of the Major Mitchell, it was an honor to fly for you today. Your story has inspired pilots around the world. Welcome back to the sky. Captain, French Air Force. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she read the message. 3 months ago, she had been alone, disgraced, forgotten by everyone except a few loyal friends. Today, pilots from around the world were saluting her courage and celebrating her return to service. As the ceremony concluded and the graduating pilots tossed their caps into the air, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The accident that had nearly destroyed her career. The months of shame and isolation in Cedar Falls. The desperate plan to buzz the ceremony in a borrowed. The vindication that had followed when the truth finally came to light. But most of all, she thought about the lesson she had learned and would pass on to every pilot she trained. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right despite that fear. That integrity matters more than career advancement. That standing up for the truth is worth any sacrifice. Later that evening, as the last of the families left the base and the celebration wound down, Sarah found herself walking alone across the same airfield where her story had begun. The hangar stood silhouetted against the sunset, and the smell of jet fuel brought back 1,000 memories. Jim was waiting for her by the fence that separated the base from the civilian airport next door. He had been invited to the ceremony as Sarah's guest, and he wore his best suit for the occasion. "So, Major Mitchell," he said with a grin, "I guess this means you won't be needing that weekend job anymore." Sarah laughed and shook her head. "Actually, Jim, I was hoping you'd still have me. These new pilots need to understand that flying isn't just about military missions. They need to remember that aviation is about freedom, about the pure joy of being in the sky. I can't think of a better place to teach them that than Mountain View Airport." "Well, in that case, you're always welcome, but I might have to raise your hourly rate now that you're famous." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the western sky. In the distance, they could see the lights of Cedar Falls beginning to twinkle on. The same town that had whispered about Sarah's disgrace was now proudly claiming her as their own. The local newspaper had run a front-page story about her reinstatement, calling her Cedar Falls' own hero. "Jim, can I ask you something?" Sarah said. "That day when I asked to borrow did you really think I was crazy?" The older pilot chuckled. "Completely insane. But sometimes crazy is exactly what the world needs. Sometimes it takes someone willing to risk everything to remind the rest of us what really matters." As they talked, neither of them noticed the small figure watching from the shadows near the hangar. It was a young girl, maybe 10 years old, who had slipped away from her family's car in the parking lot. She pressed her face against the chain-link fence, staring at the woman in the Air Force uniform. The girl's name was Emma, and she was Captain Mike's daughter. She had heard her father talking about Major Mitchell, about how she was the bravest pilot he had ever known. Emma had been thinking about that conversation all day, ever since she watched the amazing flyover at the ceremony. "Excuse me," Emma called out, her voice small but determined. "Are you Major Mitchell?" Sarah turned, surprised to see the child at the fence. She walked over and knelt down to be at eye level with the girl. "I am. What's your name?" "Emma, my dad is captain. He says you're the best pilot in the whole Air Force." Sarah smiled. "Your dad is pretty good himself. What are you doing out here by yourself? Shouldn't you be with your family?" "I wanted to ask you something." Emma's eyes were bright with curiosity and something that looked like hero worship. "My dad says you flew a plane over the graduation ceremony to prove you were right about something. Is that true?" "It's true. Sometimes adults make mistakes, and sometimes other adults have to do brave things to fix those mistakes." "I want to be a pilot someday," Emma said. "But my mom says girls don't usually fly fighter jets. She says it's too dangerous." Sarah felt her heart clench. This was why she had fought so hard, why she had risked everything to reclaim her place in the cockpit. Not just for herself, but for girls like Emma who needed to see that anything was possible. "Emma, let me tell you a secret," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "The sky doesn't care if you're a boy or a girl. It only cares if you're brave enough to earn your place there. And if you work hard enough, study hard enough, and never give up on your dreams, you can fly anything you want. Fighter jets, passenger planes, helicopters, even rockets to the moon." The girl's eyes widened. Really? Really? And if anyone ever tells you that you can't do something because you're a girl, you remember Major Sarah Mitchell. You remember that I flew fighter jets for 15 years and that I never gave up, even when things got really hard. Emma nodded solemnly, as if she was memorizing every word. Then she surprised Sarah by reaching through the fence and grabbing her hand. Thank you, Major Mitchell. I'm going to be just like you someday. As Emma ran back to her family's car, Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the evening air. This was why she had fought so hard to clear her name. This was why she had risked everything in that bar 3 months ago. It wasn't just about her career or her reputation. It was about the Emma of the world, the young girls who needed to see that women could be heroes too, that they could fly faster than sound and higher than the clouds, that they could stand up to injustice and win. As Sarah walked back toward the base, she thought about the pilot who had honored her with that spectacular silent dive. Captain, a woman who had broken barriers in the French Air Force just as Sarah had broken them in the American military. They had never met, but they understood each other in the way that only pilots could. The international flyover had been more than just a spectacular show. It had been a statement, a message sent around the world that excellence in aviation had no nationality, no gender, no boundaries except those imposed by fear and prejudice. Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Lieutenant Davies, Captain Davies now. Sarah, I saw the ceremony on the news. That flyover was incredible. I wanted you to know that I'm proud to serve under your command, and I'm grateful every day that you were my instructor on that training flight. You saved my life in more ways than one. As Sarah reached her car, she took one last look at the airfield where so much of her life had unfolded. The runway where she had first learned to fly military aircraft. The hangar where she had spent countless hours maintaining her F-16. The platform where she had been stripped of her rank and dignity, and where today she had been honored as a hero. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be young pilots to train, aircraft to maintain, missions to plan. There would probably be more people like Colonel, people who believed that women didn't belong in the cockpit or the boardroom or anywhere else that mattered. But tonight, Sarah Mitchell was at peace. She had fought the good fight and won. She had proven that truth and courage could triumph over lies and prejudice. And somewhere in Cedar Falls, a little girl named Emma was probably lying in bed, dreaming of the day when she too would wear the wings of a military pilot. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning. Major Sarah Mitchell was back where she belonged, and the sky was no longer the limit, it was home.